As the ambient temperature in this case is 75 degrees Fahrenheit, the high pressure reading should be between 130 and 150 pounds per square inch. At high humidity, this reading will be 10 to 20% higher. The low pressure reading at the evaporator is 23 psi, normal according to the chart. To simulate a higher ambient temperature without changing the humidity, place a piece of cardboard in front of the condenser to restrict the airflow. Adjust the engine speed to 1500 RPM and allow the high pressure reading to increase to 250 psi. The temperature of the air at the right center vent will increase slightly. Now remove the blockage from the front of the condenser. The gauge reading should drop to between 150 to 165 psi. At this point, read the temperature on the thermometer inside the vehicle. If the reading is not returned to between 40 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, then the system is overcharged. To quick test the components on the system, let the engine idle and spray the expansion valve control head with liquid R12 for 10 to 15 seconds. The evaporator low reading should drop to 15 inches of mercury or vacuum. If not, the valve is stuck open and should be replaced. If vacuum is obtained, place a warm rag on the valve control head and watch the low pressure gauge reading rise to 30 psi. Then stabilize to between 20 to 28 psi. If the pressure does not rise, the valve is stuck closed, or there is a restriction in the high pressure system. To check the evaporator pressure regulator valve, if you don't have an auxiliary gauge, disconnect the low pressure gauge and connect it at the head of the compressor. Then turn the blower switch to low speed. The auxiliary low pressure reading should drop into a vacuum for a short period of time until the evaporator suction pressure rises. If the auxiliary gauge pressure does not drop into a vacuum, the EPR valve is stuck open and must be replaced. Now let's see if we can apply the procedure to a Ford or GM vehicle with the POA valve system. Do a visual inspection of all air conditioning and related components that can transfer heat or block airflow to the condenser or evaporator. Connect the gauge set to the appropriate test ports. Relate the pressure in the system to the ambient temperature of the shop and adjust the refrigerant pressure as needed. Start the engine and let it idle for 5 to 10 minutes. Slide the selector control lever through each mode with the blower on high speed and the temperature control to the cool position. Placing your hand over each related air vent will confirm operation of the vacuum circuit and volume airflow. Leave the selector lever in the max AC position and the blower on high speed. Adjust engine speed to 1500 RPM. Read the pressure on the gauge set and compare it with the temperature pressure chart for normal pressures. If the pressures are not normal, spray liquid R12 on the expansion valve control head. The low pressure gauge reading should drop into a vacuum. If not, the valve is stuck open. If vacuum is obtained, place your hand or a warm rag on the valve control head. If the pressure does not rise, the expansion valve is stuck closed. If the low pressure gauge indicates 30 psi or less, and the discharge air temperature is warm, check the expansion valve temperature bulb. Make sure it is clamped tightly to the evaporator outlet pipe and that the bulb insulation is in place. If the bulb is secure and properly insulated, then replace the expansion valve. If the gauge pressure is above 32 psi, disconnect the blower lead to prevent airflow to the evaporator. If the gauge pressure remains above 32 psi, replace the POA valve. If the gauge reading is 30 psi, plus or minus 2 psi, and the discharge air temperature is normal, partially cover the condenser to obtain a high pressure reading of over 300 psi. If the low side gauge reading increases above 32 psi, replace the expansion valve. If pressure remains at 30 psi, replace the receiver dryer.
Now, let's look at the General Motors Cycling Clutch Orifice Tube, or CCOT system, and quick test the thermostatic switch and orifice tube.
Connect the gauge set and relate pressure to the shop air temperature. Add refrigerant R12 if needed. Start the engine and let it idle for 5 to 10 minutes. Select Max AC and place the temperature dial to the cool position with the blower on high speed. Adjust the engine speed to 1500 RPM. Read the gauge pressure and compare it with the chart for normal pressure readings. If the reading is not normal, disconnect the blower lead. The compressor clutch should disengage before the low pressure reading drops to 22 psi, and then re-engage before the pressure rises to 46 psi. If the gauge reading goes below 22 psi or above 48 psi, then the low pressure cutoff or thermostatic switch is defective. When the low pressure switch cycles the compressor clutch off at 22 psi, watch the gauge needles. If the needle moves very slowly, the orifice tube is restricted and must be removed for inspection.